Let's get started. My name is Bill Harder. I'm with CTRL. I'm a qualitative and survey research methodologist. So before I get into the session and sort of tell you more about myself, since it's the beginning of a new semester and these workshops often have a lot of people that have not sort of previously been at AU, and because there's a small group of us, it's probably worth the time to go around and do introductions and what departments you're coming from, if you don't mind. Great, thanks. So let me tell you a little bit about, since I've got you as a captive audience, what my role here is at the university as well. So I teach in the government department and in SIS, but my full-time role here as a staff member is in our Center for Teaching, Research, and Learning as a methodologist. We actually have a team of 2 methodologists. I work on the qualitative, survey, and mixed methods side. We also have a computational and quantitative methodologist. That's an experimental psychologist by training. He and I are basically here to serve the university writ large when it comes to strengthening and supporting the research produced by faculty and staff here, and PhD students, postdocs, things like that. So you're going to see a lot of sessions and workshops led by us throughout the year that are available in different sort of methodological techniques or software or approaches. We're also going to facilitate discussions with a number of other faculty members on some different methodological areas and research areas. The other thing that we do is the majority of our job is consulting. So we are here to basically, you want to have a follow-up conversation about Qualtrics or about survey design, or you want somebody to talk through sort of a research design or methodological approach or review a paper or a grant proposal. That's what we're here for. We're also happy to get written into grants, things like that. So make use of us while we're around. The other thing we do is we think about sort of how we teach these things. Research methods courses for a long time are the sort of eat your vegetables courses, right? And we know from student evaluations that teaching that they have often much lower averages on those sort of methodological courses. So another part of our job is to sort of have conversations and really think critically about how we're teaching these concepts. Whether it's things like quantitative and regression analysis, or whether it's things like archival research, interviewing, much more sort of qualitative skills. So use us. We're here for you. All right, let's look at what we're going to do today. This is all about survey research and our supported survey platform at this university, Qualtrics. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what Qualtrics is, maybe how it's different from things like SurveyMonkey and Google Forms that you might have encountered before. Then I want to think about both how you can use Qualtrics in the classroom, how it can be used to strengthen teaching, to produce original data for your students to play with, even just logistically to automate some feedback from students throughout the semester, things like that. Then we're going to talk about what Qualtrics can do for your own scholarship and research. And I will highlight some ongoing studies by other faculty members here at the university. And we'll talk a little more about what CTRL can do in this field. So I'd like to run through this, and then depending on time permitting and interest, we'll actually take a look at Qualtrics, and I can show you sort of what the interface looks like and some of the things that it can do. All right? And I want this to be useful for you, so feel free to jump in at any point if there's questions or clarifications, or if you want to see a specific feature in Qualtrics. So let's ask the big overarching question. What is Qualtrics? It's a browser-based survey platform, so there's nothing to download or install. It all runs off of an internet browser. And by default, the way we've negotiated the license here, every member of the AU community has an account. So faculty, staff, and students, basically if you have an american.edu email address, you have an account. It just needs to be activated. This makes it really reasonable for a couple of things. One, on original faculty research, it makes collaboration really easy between faculty members, but also to bring in graduate assistants and research assistants onto the same project. It's not like we're buying individual licenses of Stata or something like that. Everybody already has an account. It also makes it perfect for sort of group projects because your students all automatically have an account, and so we can group them into groups together to collaborate on projects, surveys within Qualtrics. The other thing that's increasingly becoming popular, because staff members also have an account, you will see it as the back end running a lot of just sort of responses here at AU. If you filled out something for CTRL, other than the registration for this conference, it was probably powered by Qualtrics. I'm working with the Office of Merit Awards right now to run their entire data through Qualtrics. The Provost Office is increasingly using this just as a back end. So if there's something sort of logistical that your department is doing that involves collecting information from other people, let's have a discussion about how you might be able to move that system into Qualtrics. Just to give you an idea of the usership, should have updated that. This is since August 2018, so this is in the last year. We had about 3,400 surveys created within the AU system, and those generated almost 164,000 responses. So some of these are, test responses for students, but the majority of these are actual real data points that are contributing to research ongoing at American University. All right, so let's take a moment and think about why do you use this versus why do you use something like SurveyMonkey or Google Forms or another survey platform that you might have encountered, right? There's a couple reasons here. One, this is incredibly customizable. Basically, any type of data that you want to collect, with one important exception that I'm working on, you can get through Qualtrics. And that exception is, right now we don't currently have a way to have a respondent upload a file. And this matters more on the sort of staff side of things. So a lot of times somebody might want to have a survey that is a grant application or a fellowship application, and you have an attached CV to it. Right now, we don't have the capacity to have that type of file upload question, but fingers crossed, I'm working on it. In addition to the customizability, the other thing that differentiates this from SurveyMonkey and Google Forms is the security of this. This is really a secure data server. It actually, with the recent European data privacy laws that went through, we just went through an audit on that. This fits all of those standards. So if you are collecting data, particularly internationally, this is a really good just baseline to be having it live in this system rather than the ether of Google or something like that. There's also a nice industry standard tool. Basically, the academic portion of Qualtrics is a small amount of their actual business model. This is primarily used in marketing research, the back end of a lot of consumer satisfaction stuff. I guarantee in your daily lives on the internet, you're clicking on a Qualtrics tool probably multiple times a day. It's just not branded as such. So I also think for our students, this is actually a really nice thing to be able to have them put on their resume of having a little experience, because it is a signal that depending on what field they go into would be recognized. The other reason to have this as something rather than SurveyMonkey or Google Forms is because of the way that we've negotiated the license here at American University. This is really existing in a sort of partitioned set of Qualtrics that is tied to your AU ID, so it's all single sign-on. That also means that collaboration within AU is incredibly easy, but if you have co-authors or other individuals outside of AU, we can do that as well. Yeah, Jody.
Do they have to have a subscription to Qualtrics, the outsiders?
It depends, depending on how much you want them to be able to do. So there is a free version of Qualtrics that is available that anyone can get. If you have a very complex survey, I think the free one is limited to something like 10 surveys and 50 questions per survey. So they will be limited to that if they're doing the survey creation. However, if you create the survey inside the American system where that's not a limitation, but then you want to collaborate it with them, they're able to see the results, they're able to edit that survey, things like that. Other universities are likely, particularly if they're research universities, to have similar setups that we do to Qualtrics, and so that makes collaboration quite easy. But yeah, so with those caveats, you can get by with a co-author with a free account often. The other thing that, just to reiterate, you get this full account, right? So you get all of the additional services with that, and we'll talk about what some of those things are in a minute. So to access Qualtrics, it's the URL american.qualtrics.com. Because of the intricacies of single sign-on, no www or HTTP. Don't type either of those. Just go straight to american.qualtrics.com. That'll take you to something that looks like the AU portal, and you'll log in with your same credentials. I'll show you that in a few minutes, so we can take a look at it. Like I said, all members of the community have a Qualtrics account, but it needs to be activated. So if you're ever trying to collaborate something with a co-author that is inside AU or a grad student collaborator, if you can't find them in the system, that's because they have not activated their account yet. You just need to get them to go log in, and then they'll show up in the system. If for some reason you have had a Qualtrics account from a previous organization, or you're working with somebody that does, they can be migrated into the AU system. You just have to ask me. As the administrator, that's just something I can do on the back end. I should point that out. I'm the administrator for our system, so any Qualtrics-related questions can come to me. I'll have my email again at the end of this. Okay. That's the mechanics and sort of what Qualtrics is. Let's take a minute and switch and think about sort of the pedagogical aspects of this and why this would be useful in the classroom. Right? This is a conference on sort of teaching and learning. So, first thing, most obviously, right? We have classes at this university that teach survey research. So there's a couple that I've worked with in the past. We've got communications classes, right? That regularly deal with survey research and teach that as a part of their methodological sequence. So 380 and 738. We also have psychology classes here that end up teaching sort of experimental design and engaging in that type of participant research. Health promotion and management engages with a lot of similar types of research. And even over in our game lab, uses this for sort of user experience surveys and feedback of products that they're designing. And so I've worked with classes there that have done this before. Now, these are classes that are explicitly teaching to go out and produce surveys, to gather information, to gather data in their life. So let's think about sort of one of the things that you could be using your classes to generate data for, right? You can generate data, original data from a number of different populations for your own classes, right? We could be using Qualtrics to gather data from our students and then allowing them to go and analyze and play with that data, right? Obviously, be careful about self-identification, right? If the students in your class know that every respondent in this is another student in the class, I would be careful about anonymity and disclosure and things like that. Often, if your goal is to just produce a data set that your students can play with, have your students play roles, right? Give them the out of telling the class, everybody in this completes a survey. You don't have to answer honestly, but create a character, create a person, create plausible deniability for them so that we're not actually then trying to figure out who this student is at the end of the day. Because the goal is not necessarily in this, the pedagogical goal is not necessarily to create and collect sort of representative data from our students, but it's to create an original data set to allow them to play with and sort of experience that process. Going to also collect information from your students' friends, right? Just about every AU student will be on some sort of social media platform, and We can generate a survey of a couple questions that are relevant to our class that we would be interested in having some non-representative public opinion data on. Give everyone in the class a link to that survey and have them tweet it out or post it on their Facebooks or their Reddit or pin it if that's the kind of thing they're into on Pinterest. And really quickly, you can have a couple thousand responses. They also have options, and there have been classes here that have actually purchased a sample through Qualtrics. Purchasing a nationally representative sample through Qualtrics is cheaper than you would expect. And it's the kind of thing that if you have some sort of course enhancement grant and collecting some original public opinion data on a question that is at the center of your class, particularly, I don't know, a complex problems class, or another very subject-based class, right? I could imagine that in the first couple weeks of that class, we start talking about how we operationalize the concepts at the core of it. And maybe we design a couple questions that we then put out, and within about a week or so, we have some nationally representative data that come back to us that we're able to play with and look at how these concepts are considered sort of out in the general public. I also want to point out that every 2 weeks, Qualtrics runs an omnibus survey. And the idea is they get a nationally representative sample, and it is something like $200 to get a question on that survey. What you get from that is the general demographic information of the respondents and then the answers to your individual questions. The turnaround on this, if you catch them at the right time, can be you get the question on the server the day before it goes out, and within 48 hours you have your responses. So this is a really affordable sort of option if you just care about 1 or 2 questions and some demographic information. Obviously, you don't know what appeared before and after on the survey, so you can't talk about sort of question order bias or priming or things like that. But it's a reasonable option if you want to capture something that's happening sort of in the news or currently. Okay. The other thing that I'll point out is we have a captive population here in AU students, and the Office of Institutional Research is not always a fan of handing out samples of students. One of the things they're concerned about is survey fatigue, because we do send them a lot of surveys on this campus. But there have been classes in the past that have worked with Karen Frosted-Jones and her team over there to get a representative sample of the AU student body, either grad or undergrad, and then used that sample, designed a survey, and actually produced a product that was then presented to senior administration here. 2 examples of this really quickly. A few years ago, Dick Bennett in the Justice Law and Criminology Department did a class on his justice policy research class. And they decided to do one group project for the class that was framed around for the entire semester. And they worked with AU Public Safety, and they got a sample from institutional research and created this survey, Student Inclusiveness, Fear of Crime and Victimization at AU. Got about a third of the student body that they were able to distribute the survey to. Got a pretty good response rate, frankly. And then the students, throughout the entire semester, went through the process of creating the instrument, validating it, piloting it within the class and some certain friends, but not enough to bias the population. Then distributed the survey, and then went through the analysis of it together. One other component of this, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we were exploring the idea of developing a mobile app for students. The provost had a little money for this, and Wendy Melillo and Paula Weissman and I from SOC, the 3 of us put together with those School of Communications COM 380 classes a survey that generated responses on student interest and what they would value in a mobile app designed for students here at the university. This is a really nice opportunity for the students. In fact, this went over multiple sections of 380. 1 year we had them design and collect the survey. The following semester, they focused on focus groups. And so they actually did in-depth focus groups with another segment of student populations. And then in the third iteration of this class, there's actually an RFP, a request for proposals, from different designers to actually design this app. So this can be an iterated thing that goes across multiple sections, different experiences for each section, but the idea is you're having students encounter and actually engage with real applied research that is producing a product. So two ideas there, with partnerships with public safety in one case and Office of Institutional Research in both cases. The other thing is, we can also just get data from strangers, right? People love to fill out stuff on Reddit. And I know this is maybe cringy at first, but I have other friends that teach survey research, and once a week they're designing a survey with their class. Just a couple quick questions, putting on Reddit, generating 1,500 responses. Now, that's biased in all kinds of ways, right? But at the end of the day, you're creating an original 1,500 response data set weekly for students to play with. And that bias isn't a limitation, it's a feature, right? So you can talk about, well, let's look at the demographic information and think about who's overrepresented here. Think about who's not represented in here. And so, take the average stranger. Okay. So, I might think about this. We could use it in a couple ways if we think a little more big picture. We might use Qualtrics in the classroom to have students generate their own data, right? Which is sort of what we've been talking about here. And I think this is a much nicer than having them use canned data sets. One hill that I'm going to die on is that I think we do a disservice to our students when we give them the data sets out of sort of the textbook that are already clean and nice. That's not what real-world data looks like. And if your code is going to run fine the first time that you run it, as soon as you get out and you start doing your own research on messy and missing and incomplete data, that's when panic sets in for students. I would rather model that in a classroom with some messy real-world data than sort of being disingenuous by giving them cleaned, reasonable things. Even just logistically in the class, right? This is a nice way to create a survey to get feedback before student evaluations of teaching, right? Whether you're doing mid-semester feedback, whether you're doing any number of different things. In fact, this is a nice way to sort of collect any data relative to your class. I will give the caveat, non-graded data, right? If it's graded, we want that, and virtually submitted, we want that to live in Blackboard. All sort of privacy concerns, but also more because that is tied to the user ID, the official AU ID. So if something is graded, we prefer it to live in Blackboard. But in my own classes, I use this as a way to automate sort of start of the semester info cards, right? The little index cards that go around, and you write name, rank, serial number, and major, and 2 interesting facts about yourself. We might think about just creating a brief survey that lets students do that. I also, anecdotally, when we move that out of the actual classroom and out of the 5 minutes at the end of class, I haven't tested it, substantively, but I feel like disclosure is a little different there when they're not sitting around their peers and they're not cognizant of how much everybody else is writing. When I just put that box at the end that is there anything else you'd like me to know? I think I get a little more substantive answers, at least anecdotally, when I move it outside of the classroom like that. I do a thing in my class where I have a couple class periods put aside for wildcard topics that I let students pick from a list and then rank their preferences on them. I do that through a Qualtrics survey. Right? There's a link on Blackboard that lists the 10 possible topics, and they can select all the ones that they're interested in and then rank order it. And through no work other than creating the survey quickly, I then have a pretty quick output of that. The other thing that you might consider is this is a nice way to do an anonymous comment box. I know some faculty have done this before, where they make a 1-question survey. And all the thing in the survey is just an open-ended text response box. There's no identifying information. We don't collect anything else. And then a link to that survey exists on their Blackboard page and is there all semester. And the idea is anything that you want me to know, right? And you don't want to raise your hand or you don't want to come see me in office hours, but you want to point out either something that happened in class or something that you thought was misunderstood or a heated exchange that you thought I missed but you wanted to bring to my attention, or you just wanted to complain about my tie that day, right? Because we are opening the world for that. But this is a way to actually just have an anonymous comment box and take feedback all throughout the semester. And in fact, we can have it set up so that when anybody submits this, it gets pushed in an email to you so you don't have to go and continually check it. This is actually, I think, Faculty Senate has one of these and is run through this way, or some organizational unit here has an anonymous comment box like that. But basically, yeah, I would think through the ways Qualtrics can work for the pedagogical learning objectives in your class, but also the logistical sort of components. It makes life easier in a lot of ways. So let me talk through a little bit of the value of doing this, right? And there's a fair amount of research on this, a lot of it emerging right now. But the value in sort of teaching with this kind of survey data is a really authentic and experiential experience. One of the nice things about this, to go back to the example from Dick Bennett's class, the student app survey, is that we're really able to take students through an entire research project, from conception to analysis. If we think about this, right, we can take them from the initial crafting of a research question into the designing and operationalization of an instrument. This is also a great way to have a non-theoretical discussion about the IRB, right? Because we can actually pass this survey through the IRB, get approval there. We can require city training as part of the class, as an assignment that needs to be done. One caveat I will say for the IRB's sake and for your sake on the timeline, if you're going to do something like this, please reach out to them and let them know that they can expect a large project coming with maybe 32 co-investigators on it. In classes like the psychology class, their psychology experimental methods class, where every student needs to design a randomized experiment. The way the IRB works on that is they have an agreement with the faculty members that teach that class that the faculty member will function as the IRB for that class and that class only. And there's an agreement that we're not going to have things that are that controversial in it. But the students still engage with the full city training for human subjects research and things like that. But this is a really nice way to take these abstract discussions of human subject protection and actually put them in practice around a real-world survey. They can also think about or experience the process of data collection, right? They can think about where they distribute and how they distribute and who the populations that they reach are. To hammer home the fact that cleaning data is a necessary and skill that is important, so they'll have some messy and incomplete data to deal with and make some decisions about. But also the analysis and the write-up. Particularly those larger projects that have deliverables, right, to another location at the university or practicum projects. Like I said, it exposes students to the messiness of real-world data, but it lets us ask questions about respondents behaving unexpectedly. Right? I think an eye-opening student or an eye-opening experience when I teach this is often the realities of how people use that other box at the end of a multiple-choice question, and then the choices that you have to make as you go through and code what somebody decided to put in an other category, and the implications that can have. On analysis, how to deal with missing data, how to recode data, create indices, things like that, how to validate those indices. Also, what to do with open-ended responses. This is a nice way to move you into sort of some mixed methods research and think about qualitative coding. And if you're interested in that, come to my In Vivo workshop tomorrow. The other thing that it lets us do, right, is it lets us ask sort of current questions without having to rely on Pew or another actual polling firm. It's going to be unrepresented, right? If we just survey the student body here at AU, or if we survey those randoms on Reddit. But again, use that as a teachable feature in the data. I think that is a really strong tool. I'll point out one thing, and in fact, I tweeted a link to this article that just came out from Croco et al. 2019 in PS, just sort of the Journal of Record for Political Science. Student-run exit polling 101, and I should point out one of those et al. Is Liz Suhay from our own government department. This is actually a project that a lot of DC area universities do to conduct actual exit polling that are student-driven. So there's a couple people at Georgetown, some at Maryland, Liz here at AU, and then I think one person at GW. But put out dozens of students into the field in the DC, Virginia, Maryland area, conduct real-world exit polls, and actually, so a lot of this is the logistics of how to do that. But the bigger point here is this idea that student-generated data and original data sets have this degree of ownership. And they make the argument, and it's an argument I've seen borne out, is that they have this degree of ownership of the data that actually changes their experience with it and makes it a more valuable learning experience than sort of canned or administrative data. And there's increasing research coming out on this phenomenon, particularly as something that combats things like math and statistics anxiety. And this idea that just some degree of ownership and some degree of knowledge over the creation of this information goes huge ways to combat the anxiety that maybe a student that is, has some anxiety over math, quantitative analysis or statistics faces when they get a spreadsheet full of responses from a survey conducted by somebody else. And I think that's a powerful sort of ownership device that we could be incorporating into our classes. So I tweeted out a link to that article. It's publicly available at WL Harder if you want to check that out. All right. Let's shift gears for a moment and think about Qualtrics in your own research or in your scholarship that you may be conducting here. I know Jody's in the back, and we were just working on a Qualtrics survey that she's put out. But I wanted to highlight some other faculty members and some other surveys that are going on and tell you a little bit about what makes each of these unique. So Katie Borum-Chatu from the School of Communications and I put out, this is about a year and a half ago at this point, the State of the Documentary study, which is the first systematic study of the documentary film industry. This is just a big survey that was blasted out through a membership organization, the International Documentary Association, and some other avenues. And the idea is it is just a descriptive survey, right? There's no experiment here. There's nothing. We're just taking a snapshot of the field, had not been collected before. So we can do that type of study. Susanna Campbell, over in SIS with an external collaborator, has an aiding peace study that looks at development programs in Africa. The interesting thing here, two components on this, because it was largely delivered to respondents on the ground in Francophone Africa, we actually created two versions of this survey that was functioning in English and in French. The way Qualtrics works on this is you have a drop-down that you can select what language, but it defaults to, it checks your browser settings that you open the survey on, and if the default language in your browser, we have a version of the survey available that, and it automatically displays in that language. This generated a few thousand responses. The other key here, this was actually a pretty complex experiment that involved 8 different potential treatments. So this is the other thing that Qualtrics does that SurveyMonkey and Google Forms don't do to this degree. This involves really customizable randomization if you're interested in engaging in experimental research, where we can actually control some quotas and control how these things are randomly presented, even with something as complex as 8 different vignettes that were randomly presented. Here's Dick Bennett again and Brad Bartholomew from Justice, Law, and Criminology over in School of Public Affairs. Recently did a study that was powered by Qualtrics with the Frederick Police Department, who were conducting an experiment where their rollout of police-worn body cameras was actually A squad was given cameras and B squad wasn't, and they existed that way for a year. Through partnership with the police department, they gave us the name and phone number of everyone that had interacted with an officer in that year and whether or not the officer was wearing a camera. And then there was a call center set up 1 floor above us that made 100,000 calls within the last year to those individuals that had interacted with an officer. The important key here is that this is a phone survey, right? So they're not actually going online and filling out this survey, but the background in the call center was using a Qualtrics form that as they were on the phone, they were completing this Qualtrics survey. Which is the other point here, that even if you are collecting a survey with an interlocutor in person and going out and filling out a survey, this is a nice way to actually standardize the data collection. Even if you're filling out paper surveys, because that's the context you're in. I just had somebody that was doing some work in Kenya and just did not have a reliable internet access, so was doing paper surveys. But then came back to the apartment at the end of the night, had a survey set up in Qualtrics, and then entered the data via that Qualtrics form. Because it's much easier and less prone to human error to be typing into this survey than to be entering lines in a spreadsheet, right? The opportunities for human error to be 1 cell off there are a little more. And especially on things like if we have a multiple choice sort of categorical data, it's easier to check 1 button than it is to be typing in the actual categorical value label. So we might think about this. Should also point out this survey was existing in 4 languages. This was in English, Spanish, Korean, and Vietnamese, which are the 4 most commonly spoken languages in Frederick. And then the last thing I'll point out, Ethan Marish over in CAS, in the health department, had a journal study where he had a population of individuals that were completing 2 surveys a day for a 30-day period about stress management and their emotional experiences. We had automated it so that every day, twice a day, they got an email with a new survey, and we tied all of the data together so it formed a panel, and it was automatically created as panel data as the output. The other thing that we did is we automated the coding in the background so those emails that they got included incentives. Things like, you're on a 5-day streak, keep going. Or it flagged people and would send emails if they had skipped more than 1 survey so that we could then send follow-ups to encourage participation. There was financial incentives, and so this automatically generated a pay schedule of who had completed their surveys because they entered at all different points. So we had people on day 30 and on day 2 at the same time. So this is just really nice because we can automate all of these different logistical components of the research in the background. All right. Let's go back to all this is good and well, but how can I actually learn how to do it? Or how can my students learn how to do it, right? Because this is a heavy lift in some cases. Here's the things my colleagues and I will help you with. One of the things we are happy to do is come into class and do a guest lecture. Every semester I guest lecture in about 40 classes. That ranges from anything to a standard canned Intro to Qualtrics section where we'll talk about survey design, go through and get your students up and running on Qualtrics with a basic introduction, to in-depth sessions on survey and question design itself, not relying on Qualtrics as much, to things like how to set up randomized experimental designs within Qualtrics and produce data that will be reasonable and workable and require the least amount of cleaning, everything else aside. We're also going to have a number of workshops throughout the semester. So I believe right now on the CTRL website, our workshop list for the fall semester is currently posted. These are open to the entire AU community, faculty, staff, and students. Feel free to send your students. Feel free to come yourselves. I'm doing 2 Intro to Qualtrics workshops that are actually going to be hands-on in a computer lab, and 1 experimental design that is designed to pick up where that left off and talk about actual randomization. The other thing, like I said before, one-on-one consultations are available. I'm happy to sit down and talk, think through your research, or look at some data, or review a survey or an instrument. The other thing is I'm your guy for administrative support when it comes to Qualtrics. So things like migrating surveys or users. The other common thing that happens, right, is you have a grad assistant, and they create a survey for you, and then they graduate. And so now all that data is locked down. So 2 pieces of advice. 1, if you do have a grad assistant working on a survey for you, create the blank survey and share it with them. You should be the owner of all of your data. Now, worst case scenario, if the student does create it and they graduate and leave, just send me an email with the student's name and the name of the survey, and I, as the administrator in the back end, can transfer that into your account. That's just 2 clicks, so that's no problem. You should know we do not delete the data at any point unless you actively take steps to delete the data. If you do delete the data, it is wiped from the servers. But if a student graduates, and even if they graduated 2 years ago, unless they actually took steps to delete the data, we still have it in the system. I can get you access to it. Just reach out and let me know. The other thing that we can do is we can create team groups and libraries, often for staff offices or for particular labs. These are useful. We can put all the members of the lab into that so they can share libraries and question blocks and things like that. Again, that's just something I have to do on the back end. So feel free to reach out with a list of users that you want created, and I can do that for you, no problem. Okay. So that's my email address and my Twitter handle. By all means, reach out if you have any questions or you want to set up a meeting. But right now, I thought I'd open it up for questions, and then depending on interest, we could take the next sort of 15 minutes or so after questions and take a look at Qualtrics actually in the interface of it. Anybody have any questions or just observations about how you might end up using it in your class or your scholarship? Yeah.
So I have 2 questions. One, you mentioned focus groups. I wondered, I'm new here, are there facilities on campus for focus groups?
There's not a standard sort of like lab room for a focus group. There is a classroom with a one-way mirror 1 floor up. I do not think it is actually like, I think actual classes are scheduled in it, so it's not like it's put aside to be reserved for that, but you might investigate that. But yeah, there's space available, but not designated actually designed space for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then also you mentioned consulting. Does that include serving as an external evaluator on an NSF grant, if that makes sense?
Yes. So Sarah Belson and I are having some discussions about how that is going to work now because of... I'm open to it and that's an evolving process. But yes, we should have conversations about that. Yeah. We don't have a hard and fast rule yet. And it also has to do with, our team is 2 people. And so at what our load is, and we don't want to overcommit. But yeah, we are working with the newly constituted Office of Research, and seeing what the relationship there is going to be particularly on sponsored research. Yeah, do.
Okay, question back to using it in the classroom.
Yeah.
You mentioned I like the idea of using it instead of like the dreaded index cards that everybody's so sick of. So what would the output look like for us? Would that be in an Excel, or would that be how?
Yeah. So what you're going to get at the end of the day, and maybe this isn't opportunity for us to move into Qualtrics is all Qualtrics data is exportable in a number of formats. So at its base, we can export to CSV or TSV files that are readable in Excel or importable into statistical packages. It also exports directly into .sav files, so SPSS data files. And frankly, in the latest versions of sort of Stata and SAS and things like that, they all read SPSS data at this point. And so, the days of stat transfer and things like that are quickly going to the wayside. That's nice because when you export into those packages, you will get both the numerical values behind it and the value labels on top of it. So you'll get that sort of multidimensional data. The other thing that we can do, particularly for those sort of student info sheets, is we can actually export these surveys as they were filled out by the students, so it'll look like a completed survey. And often, for that type of thing, that's what I'll hand out, because I really want to look at them individually and not in aggregate statistics. Yeah. So here's the American.Qualtrics.com. Like I said, it looks like the portal. The first time you're going to log in, you will get a pop-up window. Just click I do not have a Qualtrics account, and it'll give you some boilerplate to agree to. And eventually you'll get into the system. So I can even, here's an example from a class that I'm teaching right now. It's an online class. I have a virtual guest speaker. So students they get a bio and some things written by the guest speaker to read. And then I give them a link to this survey, which is just a one question open-ended text box where they can submit their question. Because this is an online class, they might not all sign on at the same time and be in the virtual room with the guest speaker, so they have the opportunity to submit questions beforehand. They can type the question here. If they want to get credit on the discussion boards, they put in their first and last name, or they can ask a question anonymously, but they don't get credit for that. For what the students see, it looks like this when they activate it. Qualtrics is always going to appear. Boy, this is not scaled right for this screen. Students, you will always have a version for in-browser, and everything will also be scaled for a mobile device. So your questions will sort of scale to whatever size device you're on. If it's an old iPhone with a small screen, it's one of the bigger new ones. If it's an iPad. You will also know whether they took it in browser or on a mobile device. That will generate a variable in the background for you if you think that could have any sort of experience effect. And then my data and analysis tab at the top will show me each of my responses, so 8 recorded responses. And then if at any point I want to go here, I can click on View Responses and see the actual survey as filled out by that student. So if we had a longer student info sheet, this is pretty benign data, so rather than bring up student information, I'll show you this. You can export these as PDFs. The other thing I should note, by default, Qualtrics is going to collect IP addresses, and it's going to use those IP addresses to give you lat-long data and a geoposition. When we're here at AU, those geopositions are masked by AU's sort of generic IP address. So it's not telling you they're in X dorm room, it's telling you they're at AU. It's a thing that students get concerned about sometimes when they start to look at the data. We are able to turn that off, but just know that the default is that it is on. And then here you'll see the export options. CSV, TSV, XML, SPSS. We can export directly to Google Drive. Great. And a user-submitted sort of sequence file. The majority of times, a CSV is fine or an SPSS is fine. If you have a lot of open-ended text responses that contain special characters, you probably want to use a TSV instead, so that you're not wrongfully demarcating your data. Let me just show you a couple other things with a new blank survey. But also, while any other questions, feel free to jump in. Yeah?
So I know that you can generate quizzes in Blackboard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to, do you think there would be any benefit to using something like this for quizzes instead? Or?
So the official line at the university is all graded content should live in Blackboard. And that just has to do with some privacy things. It also has to do with the fact that we pay Blackboard to do that. The other thing is that this is, so we should talk about distribution a little bit, right? Because there are a couple ways you can distribute a survey. On this platform on distributions, if we go here, the most common, right, is a single reusable link where we generate this, and now this link, every time you click on the survey, you can complete the survey. But this is also an anonymous link, so it wouldn't necessarily work for quizzes and things like that. If we did have a Excel sheet full of student email addresses, we could upload them into Qualtrics and compose an email. It'll get sent through the Qualtrics system. And what will happen is each student, as they receive that email, this code will generate a unique link for them. So they will then take that survey. As soon as they complete that survey or quiz in this case, that link will die so that they cannot retake it. They can't give it out to anyone else. So if we were to do something like that where you needed to tie the individual quiz or survey response to a particular student, that would be the way to do it. But I wouldn't.
Like the index cards, this would be how you would do that.
Yeah, we can. I would do it this way, or I've also done it because, and I've just taken the chance of some student going in and pretending to be another student and telling me information about them, of just doing a generic link. But yeah, these are the two main ways to distribute surveys. The nice thing about this as well is that you are able to send out reminders to the incompletes without spamming everybody on your email list. You should also just point out a couple things. The email is going to look like it comes from you because you're signed in with your AU account, and if somebody replies to this email, it'll go back to you. But it's actually going to come from noreply@qemailserver.com. It's masked, but if somebody actually looks behind your name, that's what it'll be. People stress about this. You should not stress about this because Qualtrics spends a lot of money to keep this email address out of spam filters, and your email looks like spam. Right? It's hey, take this survey. So this is going to make it to inboxes. This is also all this is customizable. Should also point out that we have it'll make a survey link for social media platforms if you want to distribute it through that. You can generate QR codes. Right, which was supposed to be the big thing a decade ago, and then they were pretty lame. But here's the cool thing. Within the last iOS update, and I believe within this Android update, smartphone cameras now automatically have QR readers in the cameras. You used to need a separate app, and that's why they never took off. So actually, we're seeing these sort of increasingly come back because they don't require a separate app, they just require a smartphone. So, if you're blasting your survey on sort of an open poster or something like that, this is a potential way.
My textbook has a bunch of these embedded in it. It explains the figures. Does anyone else have that in their text?
Yeah, I've seen it. It's pretty nice. Yeah, it took us a while to figure out how to do it, but now it's catching on. This is the basic interface as you're designing the survey. And it's really intuitive. It's literally just click to write the question text, click to write the choice text. And let me just really quickly, because we're running out of time, show you these are all your different question options. So we can do things like standard multiple choice or check all that apply, open-ended text entry. We do rank order questions where individuals are given sort of 5 categories and they rank them, drag and drop them in order. If you're doing Likert scales, these matrix tables, sort of slider questions, these don't work well on mobile devices, but if you want them to rank it on sort of a 100-point scale or something like that, we can do those. Side-by-side comparisons, constant sums, maybe this has to total 100. We can ask them to divide things into groups and then rank them within those groups, so this can start to get really complex. If you're doing something visually, we can do these hotspots. We upload an image and we ask the respondents to click on an area of the image, and we define the area into different quadrants. Or similarly, without that background, we can just do a heat map and ask them to click somewhere in the area, and this will generate sort of XY coordinates that we can pull out, so we can look at where, if individuals are able to identify particular places or where their eye goes first according to their self-reporting. Graphic sliders, if you're into this. Drill down questions where we have sort of nested decisions. We can also do some other things in the background. Signatures, net promoter scores. There's some timing questions. Often in the sort of experimental design psychology classes, we do things where we want to show a series of images for the implicit bias test, where you get a series of images for a quarter second each. Things like that. We can automate this whole through there. But it comes with a number of different types of questions. I should also say, in the background, this can integrate with things like Mechanical Turk. If you want to distribute this through there, you can have them generate a random code at the end of the survey that is their Mechanical Turk, a code that they go to get paid. So I have some code that we can talk about that if you're a researcher that uses Mechanical Turk. Any other questions? I know we're just about out of time.
You said to navigate to this, it's american.qualtrics?
American.qualtrics.com. Yeah.
I have a question about opportunities for students to develop these skills outside of classes that focus on research or CTRL workshops. Are there any student clubs that
I know Kogot has an analytics club, and that's the closest thing I think that there is. But no, there aren't other sort of organizations that I know of. Anybody else has encountered them? But that analytics club is active and spend a lot of time sort of at night doing R and Python. And in fact, my colleague and I have gone in and done workshops for them sort of after hours before. So that's one place I'd recommend to look. The other thing is there's some good sort of meetup communities in DC that may not be AU focused, but particularly if you're in the open source world like R and Python, I'd encourage you to look outside of AU. To some of the DC-based meetups. Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I'll be around if you want to chat, and have a good semester, everybody. Which is, I know we're not ready to say that yet.
No.